All right. I will welcome you all in our today's session. As you can see, today we're going to talk about medieval philosophy. And this is going to be our first part of medieval philosophy. And I'll try to make it as simple as possible. Now, in our first slide, I think someone has, could you please just turn off your microphone? Okay, now it's great. It's good. Now we can hear. Now, medieval philosophy, actually, it's started in the Middle Age, and the time is spent that extends from the 14th century to 15th century. And you can see in the slides, I have already highlighted that part, that 14th and 5th centuries added to the Renaissance of the 15th century. And Renaissance period, more or less, from your literature, from your history of the literature part, you have already come to know a little bit about the Renaissance period. So I don't want to talk about it that much anymore. But if it is necessary, then of course we will go back to the Renaissance period, and then we'll come back again to our medieval period as well. Now, the main important thing about the medieval period is that it focuses on the Christian theology primarily, and also some of the parts of the logic, and also from the other part of the philosophy, just like the classical philosophy that we call, or Hellenistic philosophy, that is the Greek philosophy. They also brought lots of information from there, and also they try to use those knowledge in their explanation of the medieval philosophy. But primarily it was the theological, or the Christian theology, particularly we should talk about it. The Christian theology was heavily influenced by this medieval philosophy. And medieval philosophy also, we can see the influence of other two philosophies, that is the Islamic philosophy and also the Jewish philosophy, or we can say the Jewish theology and Islamic theology. They also influence this medieval philosophy. And since it started from these theological explanations, so you can understand it very well that the churchmen, or people who worked in the church, they were you can see the prominent figures actually who introduced this philosophy into the Western philosophy. Now, here in the next slide, you can see that the Greek philosophy ceased to be creative after Plotinus in the 3rd century. A century later, Christian thinkers such as Saint Ambrose, Saint Victorinus, and Saint Augustine began to assimilate new Platonism to Christian doctrine in order to give a rational interpretation of Christian faith. So there is a name, Plotinus. I think that some of you may be familiar with this name. Plotinus, actually, he was a philosopher from Roman Egypt. That means the present day Egypt, but at that time it was the part of the Roman Empire. And he actually introduced this Platonic philosophy in a different angle, in a different way. And as you can see, from Plotinus actually started explaining Platonic philosophy, philosophy of the Plato. It is not that the Plato's philosophy wasn't explained by the earlier people. The explanation or interpretation of Platonic philosophy, it was a kind of ongoing process. But Plotinus, actually, he started interpreting or explaining the Platonic philosophy from a different angle, from a new angle. And that philosophy that we call from today's perspective, we call is New Platonism. And you can see that later on, other, you can say, theologians, especially the Christian theologians like Saint Augustine, and also later on, we can see you can see the Saint Ambrose and also Saint Victorinus. All these philosophers, all these theologians, they are influenced by this new Platonism, and they try to introduce these Platonic ideas. They try to synthesize these Platonic ideas and also the Christian theologies together from a different angle. Thus, medieval philosophy was born of the confluence of Greek, not a lesser extent of Roman, Greek philosophy and the Christianity. So you can see the medieval philosophy, actually, this is the combination of the Greek philosophy and the Christian philosophy together, or you can say the Christianity. So the Platonist philosophy was already deeply religious, having come under the influence of Middle Eastern religions. Middle Eastern religions means actually they want to talk about the Christian religions, Middle Eastern in Middle Eastern countries, you understand. That is the Mediterranean basin that we call. So at that time in the Roman Empire, it started getting influenced by this Christianity, and also the Christian theologians, they were also influenced by this Neoplatonism. And this combination of Neoplatonism and the Christian theology, that we call the synthesis of these two, we have got this medieval philosophy at that time. Now, medieval philosophy continued to be characterized by this religious orientation that I have already explained. That religious orientation means that Christian religion specifically, that was synthesized or that was assimilated with the Greek philosophy, and that's why actually we have got this medieval philosophy in this way that we can see in present time. Its methods were at first those of Plotinus. So Plotinus started this method, that means this Neoplatonism, and later those of Aristotle. So the Aristotelianism or Aristotle's philosophy, Saint Augustine and Saint Aquinas, especially actually, he took this idea of Aristotelian philosophy and he also tried to assimilate those Aristotelian philosophy into the medieval philosophy, the Christian theology specifically. But it developed within faith as a means of throwing light on the truths and mysteries of faith. Now, you see, at that time, the Christian theology, it was challenged by the existing philosophy and also the existing academicians, or we can see the thinkers. The reason is that the Christian philosophy, or Christian theology, actually, I should say Christian, not philosophy, Christian theology, that means as a religion, Christianity failed to explain some of the issues. Those are highly philosophical. And Christian theology was challenged by the existing philosophy. So that's why some Christian theologians, they took help from these Western philosophies, especially these Greek philosophies, and also we can say that this Neoplatonic movement, they took help from those philosophical ideas. And they tried to use those philosophical ideas in explaining or to explain their Christian theology, just to satisfy or quench the thirst of the knowledge of the people of that time. So that's why we say that it developed within faith as a means of throwing light on the truths and mysteries of faith. Thus, religion and philosophy faithfully cooperated. So you see the philosophy and the religion, both they cooperated faithfully in the Middle Age. Philosophy as you can say the handmaiden of theology, made possible a rational understanding of faith. So philosophy helped to understand the faith, that means to understand the Christianity. It helped to understand the faith. For experts inspired Christian thinkers to develop new philosophical ideas, some of which became part of the philosophical heritage of the West. So inspired the Christian thinkers to develop their philosophical ideas, amalgamating the Christianity and also the philosophical ideas at that time that was existing in the Western world. So, and therefore actually we have got this development of the medieval philosophy. Now, toward the end of the Middle Ages, the beneficial interplay of faith and reason started to break down. Philosophy began to be cultivated for its own sake, far from and even in contradiction to Christian religion. This divorce of reason from faith made definitive in the 17th century by Francis Bacon in England and René Descartes in France marked the birth of modern philosophy. Now here you can see that how actually this medieval philosophy actually it came to its fruition, we can say the completion, and then later on we can see that how actually it stopped to influence people, and then how actually it was moving towards Renaissance. There you can see, I will explain it to you and make it simply. See, interplay of faith and reason started to break down. That means the way the earlier philosophers or theologians, they were using reason, they're using philosophy to explain faith, to explain Christianity, to explain Judaism, to explain Islam, actually it started breaking down. It didn't work anymore. So philosophy began to be cultivated for its own sake. That means philosophy started to be secular. That was and this was a breach from the religion. That means in the medieval philosophy, we can see that the medieval philosophy is heavily influenced by the theology. But with the advancement of time, we can say that this influence of the faith or religion, actually it was beginning to be, what should I say? I mean, it was declining. It wasn't having that kind of influence anymore. And philosophy was going to be a different strand of knowledge. It was going to be established in the Western philosophy as a separate knowledge. That is philosophy, not philosophy plus theology or Christianity. It's completely philosophy. There is no faith in it, just the logic. And that was the development of the Renaissance period. And it was ushered by Francis Bacon in England and René Descartes in France. So that was the end of, I mean, you can say the medieval period, that we can say, that how actually it was moving forward to the Renaissance period. Now, let's take a look at a little bit of historical and geographical boundaries. That means how actually the historical development and how actually, I mean, these geographical boundaries will help us to understand this medieval philosophy. Now you can see the term medieval or Middle Age is derived from the Latin expression medium autumn, that is the Middle Age, coined by Renaissance humanists to refer to the period separating the golden age of classical Greece and Rome from what they saw as the rebirth of classical ideals in their own day. The humanists were writing from the perspective of the intellectual culture of Western Europe, and insofar as their conception of a Middle Age corresponds to an identifiable historical period, it corresponds to a period in the history of the Latin West. Now, here in this slide, what it says that the Renaissance humanists actually they introduced this this term medieval philosophy of the Middle Ages, so that they can have a demarcation line, or they can have you can say, I mean, they can separate it from the classical Greek period and also the Renaissance period. Just for your understanding, if we say, I mean, from a very broader perspective, if we just say for our understanding, that the Western philosophy, if we try to divide it or bifurcate it, then we can find the classification into three different parts. One is the ancient philosophy, the medieval philosophy, and the modern philosophy. So you see the humanist, or you can say these humanists actually, they are the part of, you can say they are the part of this Renaissance movement. So they just divided this medieval period or Middle Ages, I mean, within this specific time frame, so that people can understand it, that what is ancient, what is middle, and what is modern. So the humanists actually, they contributed to, they helped us to understand the difference between these three different periods of philosophy in the Western philosophy, history of the Western philosophy. Okay. I hope you understand the humanists, right? Do you know, I mean, who are humanists?
Yes, sir.
Humanists actually, they are part of the Renaissance movement, and they believe in the logic mostly, and also they believe in the humanity. So the logic and humanity, they combine it, and in most cases we can find that humanists, they don't depend on the faith or the religion. Moreover, they depend on the human individualism and also the human logic. Now, the historical boundaries of medieval intellectual culture in Western Europe are marked fairly clearly, on the one end, by the disintegration of the cultural structures of Roman civilization, and you can see that the medieval intellectual culture, the boundaries, and Western Europe are marked fairly clearly on the one end by the disintegration of the cultural structures of Roman civilization. So you see, when the Roman civilization actually, it was on the brink of decline, and literally actually it was declining. The empire actually as an empire, it was losing its influence on the rest of the part of the world, and that's why you can say there's a kind of disintegration of culture. That means the influence of the Roman culture or the Roman civilization wasn't felt. I mean, in that way, because other empire was at that time they were having their influence on the rest of the world. So there is some justification, therefore, taking medieval philosophy as disintegrating primarily the philosophy of the Latin ways from about 400 to 1400. So you can see the exact time frame. Roughly, we can say that's the third century, that is the 400, from the 1400, or you can say the 13th century. So from third to 13, that is almost 1,000 years. Actually, we can say that was the medieval philosophy. That was the time for the medieval philosophy, that we can say. Now, there are, of course, significant non-Latin philosophical developments in Europe and the Mediterranean world in this same period in the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire, for example, and in Arabic-speaking Islamic and Jewish cultures in the Near East, Northern Africa, and Spain. I've already mentioned at the very beginning of our today's lecture that this medieval philosophy is not only the philosophy, influenced by the Christian theology. It's not only about the Christian theology, it's also about other religions at that time. Because you see, within this 1,000 period of time, that means 1400 to 400 to 1400, you can see that we can also see within this period of time, the Judaism, it also developed as a religion, and also we can see the appearance of Islam right at that within this period of time. Because Islam actually it came, we can say in the sixth century. So you see the 400 to 1400 within this time, we can see the Judaism, that is Jewish people, and also we can see Islam as religion. All right, now here, and you can see these religious group, these people, it expands in the whole Mediterranean Sea, and also you can see the Northeast, Northern Africa also, and also in Spain. So medieval philosophy as a philosophy, it's huge. I mean, to this philosophy, you can see that almost all the continents, people from the continents, they try to contribute with their knowledge, with their religion, for the development of this medieval philosophy. So none of these philosophical traditions, however, was radically cut off from the philosophical heritage of the ancient world in the way the Latin-speaking West was by the collapse of the Roman Empire. For that reason, those traditions are the best treated separately from the Western Europe. Accordingly, they are dealt with in this article, in this presentation, only to the extent to which they influence developments in the medieval philosophy in the Latin West. That means there's none of these philosophical traditions was radically cut off from the philosophical heritage of the ancient world in the way the Latin-speaking West was by the collapse of the Roman Empire. Now, here we can see this is very significant to understand that with the collapse of the Roman Empire, especially the people living in the Europe, they were cut off from the rest of the world, especially from their ancient history. But you can see the other traditions, the Judaic and also the Islamic tradition, people from these traditions, they were not separated from, these ancient civilizations. And we can see that lots of books of the ancient history and also the ancient philosophy, books related to these history and philosophy, those were translated by, you can see the Islamic scholars into Arabic. And you can see that people in the Western world, actually, they learned Arabic and they come to know about these Western philosophies through this Arabic translation, and later on those are translated into their native languages, like English at that time that was used, and also in the other Roman languages. Okay, so you can see the influence that how these people from Judaic and also the Islamic tradition, they influence this medieval philosophy. Now, the general character of medieval philosophy in the West is determined to a significant extent by historical events associated with the collapse of Roman civilization. The overrunning of Western Europe by invading Goths, Huns, and Vandals brought in its wake not only the military and political defeat of the Roman Empire, but also the disintegration of the shared institutions and culture that had sustained philosophical activity in late antiquity. So you can see that how this, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, and also this Roman Empire actually, they were invaded by other groups of people, by other empire like Goths, Huns, and Vandals. And because of this attack by the other groups of people, and because of this collapse of the Roman Empire, so the people living in the Roman Empire, they got separated from their ancient, this ancient philosophy and ancient traditional civilizations. Then Boethius, and he is a very one of the prominent philosophers of this medieval philosophy, a Roman politician, a Roman patrician by birth, and the high-ranking official in the Ostrogothic king's administration, is an eloquent witness to the general decline of intellectual vitality in his own day. He announces his intention to translate into Latin and write Latin commentaries on all the works of Plato and Aristotle, and he gives as his reason the fear that, lacking this sort of remedial aid, his own Latin speaking and increasingly ill trained contemporaries will soon lose access altogether to the philosophical legacy of ancient Greece. Now, I'll make it simple for you. Here you see the Boethius. He was also a patrician. That means he was a theologian, and also he worked in the church in in Italy, and he was a very high-ranking official in the Orthodox king's administration. That means he was an administrator. He was a churchman. I mean, lots of things together, and also he was a very educated person, and he was a philosopher. Now, he found that this separation or this collapse of Roman Empire from the rest of the civilization is very, you can say, it's very detrimental to the development of the Western philosophy. That's why he thought that he must take some initiative to translate those words from this original language to the Latin words, or you can say the Latin speaking. I mean, for the people of the Latin speakers, he wanted to translate those from the original language into Latin, so that people in the Roman Empire, the existing Roman Empire, still they can learn from the philosophy of their forefathers, though they're separated from the rest of the world because of the collapse of the Roman Empire. So, and also he was very worried about the ill-trained contemporaries. That means his contemporary, other contemporary philosophers, or contemporaries means the contemporary writers, philosophers, or the people, they were not well trained in this translation work, or in the Latin language, or in the original language, the Greek language. So that's why actually he was worried about it very much. That means this legacy, this philosophical legacy of the ancient Greece, it might lose its touch with the present medieval world. That means the Roman Empire. So that's actually he started translating, or he also started writing commentaries on these Greek works, so that the people in the Roman Empire, those who are speaking Latin, still they can have some taste of this Greek philosophy. Now, Boethius' assessments of situation appears to have been particularly astute, for in fact, in the 6th centuries, following his death, philosophers in the West depend almost entirely on Boethius himself for what little access they have to the primary texts of the Greek philosophy. So you see that what happened, that people in the next six centuries, almost 600 years, you can see that most of the Latin philosophers are people who are speaking Latin. They heavily depended on Boethius' translations or on his commentaries of the original Greek works, because he translated some of the works, and also he left his comments in Latin language on the Greek philosophies. Moreover, since he had barely begun to carry out his plan when his execution for treason put an end to his work, Boethius' fears were substantially realized. Now you see, there was a problem that Boethius, at one point of his career, actually, he was executed for treason. He was beheaded for treason, and Before that, you see, even before his death, he was very worried about the situation that he couldn't finish his task of translating the important words from Greek to Latin. And he was very scared that with his death, this translation work might get some kind, might face some problem, and it happened. That's why it says that Boethius' fears were substantially realized. You see that with his death, the translation work or the commentaries in Latin language, from Greek to Latin language, the translation work, it was hampered, and that's why it suffered. It suffered, and people didn't have that much access to the original language, Greek, because at that time, most of the people are also the scholars existing in the Roman Empire. They couldn't speak. Greek. So that's why they didn't have that much access to the Greek philosophy. Only through Boethius' translation, they could get some access to the Greek philosophy. So having translated only Aristotle's treatise on logic, together with Porphyry's introduction to the Aristotle's categories, and having completed commentaries on only some of the texts he translated, Boethius left subsequent generations of medieval thinkers without direct knowledge of most Aristotle's thought, including the nature of philosophy, metaphysics, and ethics, and with no text of Plato. So you see what happened then? That with the death of Boethius, they had limited access to these to the text. And Boethius translated several of Aristotle's treatises. That means he mainly actually translated Aristotle's works, but he couldn't finish translating all his works. And also he couldn't finish translating Plato's works. So as a result, the Western people, especially people in the Roman Empire, they didn't have that much access to the Aristotle's works and Plato's works in Latin, in their language, because they were not translated from Greek to Latin. Before Boethius, nobody take that kind